Welcome to Millennium Counseling Center's podcast, where each week we go in depth into all things mental health, addiction recovery, and being our healthiest and happiest self. Enjoy. Derek, I think we can all agree that being honest is a characteristic or a way of going through life that we all kind of aspire to. But maybe it's not something that we necessarily do all the time in all of our relationships, especially if we're struggling or there's some conflict between two people, or we struggle with letting people really know about what's going on in our lives. When someone brings this up in session with you, kind of where does your mind go and where do you try to take that conversation?
Yeah, this comes up a lot and a lot of the work that I do. And I think that what I think of when you say that is kind of the way that I think we oftentimes define these things. And if you look at these words like honesty, dishonesty, and I believe there's another level, which is transparency. And so when people strive to be honest, many times how they define that is that it's the absence of dishonesty. So basically that as long as I'm, in quotes, not dishonest, then that means that I'm honest and therefore means that I'm transparent. And I think that naturally, at least with certain folks that I work with, to them, what it means is that they didn't lie about something. So basically, as long as I didn't lie about something, then I was being honest. And that doesn't include lies of omission, trying to kind of having somebody believe that they know something to be true and then that actually not being the case. And so one of the things that I really work with people a lot on is transparency. The goal should not be to not lie, but it should be to be transparent about the things that are going on in our life and with those people who kind of deserve to know that. And I think you can use a lot of examples with that, but I think that's one way that we need to look at it. What do you see?
Yeah. Well, and I try to talk about a little bit of a step further where kind of transparency is telling somebody the thing, and vulnerability is telling somebody how that thing affected you. And, I would say in the work that I'm doing with clients, there's a lot of fear around being transparent and vulnerable because that information, is associated with creating anger or possibility of fracturing or breaking up a relationship. And so, for me, really kind of drilling down with people around kind of what is the benefit and purpose of that form of communication and relationship. And that's a journey for people, right? And, I think one of the things that I really try to emphasize is bringing this up in therapy is a vulnerable and courageous thing because it's showing me that they want to be different in relationships and maybe they don't necessarily know how to do that quite yet or haven't been role modeled about how to do that. And so I really try to be patient with people through this process and not just kind of like snap my finger and expect someone, okay, so now that we talked about it, this is going to be how it's going to be. But I really think that people are struggling with keeping all this information in their head of, okay, so what did this person know and what did I tell them and what kind of partial truths so that I can kind of keep it all in my head, and the freedom that really comes with somebody really knowing you for yourself, right? The freedom of I don't have to worry about someone finding out something or something slipping out in a future conversation that maybe I didn't talk about.
Yeah, I think that's all, really accurate. And I think the correlation between transparency and vulnerability is a big one. I think if you ask people why they would lack transparency or even roll over into being dishonest about something, it's that they're trying to avoid someone else's disappointment, some sort of conflict, somebody having a reaction that they don't like. But if you really, in talking to family members or partners or people who have felt like someone close to them, that their trust has been broken, that is usually bigger than the thing. There's always been the saying, it's not the crime, it's the cover up, right? And I think that's what really, really gets to people and fractures relationships. And that kind of is where transparency goes for me, is that being transparent means that you are giving the important people in your life information that is accurate. So whatever they think is going on. So if you use something like, let's say somebody is sober, and we will hear this where they will say, well, yes, I drank, but they didn't ask me if I drank. So I never said I didn't drink, right? But then what happens is that for me, the way I do it is I think about does the understanding of the person I'm talking about match what's really going on? Is there anything that is different than that? So if somebody, thinks that you are sober, but you are really not, even though you've never lied about it, you haven't said anything about it, you just haven't been transparent about it, then ultimately what that does is that leads to that trust breakdown, which is as we're working with people in recovery, kind of all forms, one of the main things they're doing is trying to rebuild trust in other people or from other people. And I think that one thing I tell people is I say, if you want to rebuild trust, here's an example of something you can do. If you have somebody who you've broken their trust, and let's say you're supposed to meet them at 6:00 and you leave a little late and you're going to be there at 6:10. So what I always encourage people to do is, text them at 5:45 or 5:30 or whatever time and say, listen, I acknowledge that you had said you would be there at 6, and then also let them know that you won't be. And the reason for that, I think, is so important is that if you have lost some trust in someone around something that's a big deal, then as soon as if I say I'm going to be there at 6 and I'm not there at 6:01, then that starts the wheels of your distrust to worrying about what I'm doing or is something happening or things like that. And with the vulnerability that you said, I think that's really true is that, being transparent is vulnerable. But to your point, it's also much easier. And if we can live our lives in a place where we're fully transparent with the people that with everyone, I guess, but with the people that it's important that they trust us and know what's going on in our life and have accurate information, then ultimately we're going to have closer relationships. And if they are fractured, they will be rebuilt quicker. The best way to rebuild trust is to be trustworthy.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that I really took away from what you were saying is that rebuilding trust or being transparent and vulnerable is not about being perfect, right? And so if you notice that there's something that you have an agreement with someone or if something is going on, talking about it exposes that lack of perfection, right? You said you're going to be sober, but you drank. You told someone you're going to be on time, but you're not going to be on time. And I think that in that moment, there may be an initial flare up of emotions, right? Because the agreement is broken. But what's kind of unseen is that there's trust being rebuilt at a foundational level because there's a level of transparency and honesty around it. And I think that's one of the things that I talk to people about, especially at the beginning of recovery or rebuilding trust in kind of in a relational way, is that this is really about the spirit behind it. It's not about the actual kind of, did I get 100 on all of these things? And talking with people about how you have to just let somebody know what's going on because that's giving them insight into what's going on in your head. And that for me has really helped rebuild trust in relationships and with ourselves because now we're not keeping secrets within our own self and lying to ourselves. We're putting it out there.
Yeah. And I think what you said about kind of it's not about being perfect. I mean, if you think about what makes people feel close to each other, is that, if I make a mistake, one of the most frustrating things for people is if somebody makes a mistake and will not acknowledge it.
Yep.
They certainly won't apologize for it, but they're not going to acknowledge it. And that's really frustrating because it feels similar to how people feel like when they're being gaslighted, right? That's something that people feel. They feel like they know the truth and this person isn't acknowledging it and they won't own it. And when you talk about kind of being close to someone, right? If I do something that I know you're going to be disappointed in or upset about, and then what I do is I acknowledge that I did that and I tell you about it before you have to kind of argue with me about it, then what that does to your point is that makes me vulnerable. But the reason why we feel closer is that because by me being vulnerable, I am trusting you to handle that vulnerability in a way that's not going to crush me. And in turn, what happens then is you understand that I am trusting you with something that I'm very vulnerable with. So therefore, you feel closer to me because not only have I told you the truth about something, but I've entrusted you with something that could be very hurtful to me. And I'm trusting that you're not going to use that in a way that's going to, really hurt me badly.
Yeah. And you kind of segue into a whole different conversation. But I think one of the things that I try to kind of emulate for people is that vulnerability is what creates intimacy and connection. And so if you're feeling disconnected because of a fracture in a relationship or because of lies, that is the way back, right? The way back is to show the parts of yourself that you're not proud of or have insecurity around, to allow the relationship to be pulled closer together with that, rather than, just kind of putting up a wall of like, oh, I got everything and I'm not going to let you into my struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we want close relationships in our lives and we want to have good relationships with people, then our goal, in the way I define these things, our goal needs to be transparency, not just the idea that I haven't lied to you or that I have a lack of dishonesty. Is that basically you believe that you have information, and if what your belief of that information is different than what actually happened, then I think that's on me. That's on me to make sure that you have an accurate understanding of these things that I'm telling you. And when the reason why that's so important is, even though I might be able to say I didn't lie to you, it feels the same to you. If you find out something that I had led you to believe was different than it really was, even if I didn't actively lie about it, the feeling for you is the same. And what that does is that erodes your trust in me. Then therefore there's no vulnerability, there's less trust, and then our relationship gets worse for that as opposed to better.